First and foremost, I wanted to thank UIC. Thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this conversation. I know you mentioned that there is a narrative to say that GIS is not going to work. Looking at this room, that's a lie. So I'm happy to see that there's so many people who are not only interested in GIS, but also work with it. It's really beautiful to see that. So my name is Yolanda Richards. As I mentioned before, I serve as an account manager here with ESRI. So how many of you are familiar with ESRI? Raise your hand. ESRI, ESRI, Environmental Systems Research Institute. I just call it ESRI. So just to give you kind of an overview of who we are as a company, we are a geolocational mapping platform. And so we are just beyond creating maps. We look at data analytics, and so our kind of motto is the science of where. For us, we really believe in how we're able to see what others can't. And so we truly believe that the work that we do and the software that we have can change the world. And so I say that because for me as an urban planner, shout out to urban planners. Who's an urban planner? Beautiful. Just to give you kind of a background, just to let you know what the conversation is going to look like today, I'm going to show you visuals, but it's really about storytelling. I just love how Tanika really captured the storytelling in maps and really telling a narrative, and so that's what the conversation is going to be. So the reason why I even got into urban planning was because of Hurricane Katrina. So when that took place, it took me probably 2 years to not think about that every day. It rocked my world coming from California to see how a natural disaster impacted people, but a particular group of people. And so it was just something that really rocked my world to really understand how you address issues of natural disasters in marginalized communities and how the government responds to that. And so for me, the reason why I'm even an urban planner is because of Hurricane Katrina. From that natural disaster, it really made me just start looking at the world differently and understanding how location is key. Something that's kind of weird about me, the term West always stays with me. I'm West African, I'm from the West Side. I used to live on the West Coast. I used to live on the West Side of Chicago, so that's kind of my directional focus. So everything West fits very comfortably for me. If I go outside of that, I just feel very uncomfortable. So location is really important to me personally. So to go back to my role at ESRI, so again, I'm an account manager, and the focus for me is the city of Chicago. So something about ESRI, I think some people might be familiar with ArcMap, ArcView, very common narratives of ESRI. We are beyond that. And so I remember taking my first GIS class in 2003. And so GIS has always stayed with me, especially with ESRI, so it's very kind of circular that I'm coming back to ESRI, so it's really a powerful thing. But one thing that we're trying to do here at the City of Chicago is create more of a GIS-centric environment. And so that includes a number of different things. Again, I work with the City of Chicago to address a lot of different issues that they're working on, so it can be issues of investment, mapping all of our cultural assets in the city of Chicago. There's so much that we do within our platform, but for me, I work specifically with the city of Chicago to ensure that they're able to solve various issues. But something that's really important for us too is that Chicago is a city of so many different things, and so we're trying to do more in terms of partnering with our universities, working with nonprofits. If you may or may not know about ESRI, we have a number of different segments to what we do. So we're not just with local government, we work in the commercial sector. So Walgreens uses ESRI. We have so many different entities and startups who use our technology. We have nonprofits that are using our work as well, because it's really important for us to make sure that people know that we are just beyond local government and commercial. We have educational institutes that use our software. So Chicago Public Schools, we're a city of neighborhoods. So when you think about location and schools, that's really important. They use our technology. We have utilities, so ComEd, water, all those different type of utilities use our software. And so what I'm trying to do is just dispel the myth that we are just ArcMap. We are all over the place, and we're trying to be intentional to show people that we care about various issues around the world, and we really want to make an impact. So I was tasked with talking about how spatial location can be really connected and addressed to social inequality. And so what I wanted to do was just show you a visual of a couple of things going on. So no disrespect to UIC, this is U Chicago. I found this interesting. What I wanted to do, I didn't want to go back to kind of the models that I'm used to. I really wanted to see what was happening in our backyard. So how many of you are familiar with the 1619 project that New York Times is doing? If you are not aware of it, please check it out. It's very, very fascinating, very controversial for a lot of people. But what has been going on, this has been run by the New York Times. And so if you may or may not know, this is kind of the 400th year commemoration of slavery. And so what they did was really tell storytelling in terms of what was happening during kind of the legacy of slavery and what happened post and how it's haunting and affecting us today. Really powerful stories looking at health disparities, and looking at slavery, looking at education, so many different fragments that have a tie to slavery. And so I actually stumbled upon this, which is really powerful. How many are familiar with the Chicago 1919 riots? Okay, so kind of a little bit of background. There's a young gentleman who was killed by a white gentleman, and so it spurred a lot of tension within the Chicago area, which led to the 1919 riots. And so what I was researching in here was how U of C created a map of the impact of the race riots in Chicago. In fact, it was stated in here that, and this is kind of the perspective of who created this, that 1919 riots actually could be one of the reasons why you see such a segregated city in Chicago, just because of the impact of what was happening. And so as I mentioned earlier, ESRI talks a lot about what you can do and how you can see what others can't. And I think this really paints an interesting picture of the impact of the Chicago 1919 riots. And so what you can see, U of C created an interactive map that allows you to actually look at the impact of what was going on. So as you can see, some of these X's represent a number of different facets. So you can see that the layers represent the riot injuries, I can't even read, arson that was taking place. And what's cool about ESRI, they're really trying to be a lot more interactive, so you're able to put videos in your maps, you're able to put visuals to really tell the narrative in the story. And as you can see, when you kind of look out of the map, it's happening in particular areas and segments of the city, and it would really be powerful to see kind of what that map looks like today, just to see and really make that linkage of kind of the before and after and how it's haunting or having a deep impact just from a locational perspective. So I just thought it was really powerful to show that, because U of C was trying to be very intentional to really capture what was happening with the Black population. And if you think about that time, economic development, businesses were booming in a lot of areas that were predominantly African American. And so when you look at the riots and what the impact was, a lot of businesses that were destroyed, a lot of business owners who had to flee and leave. And again, to be able to show a visual narrative of that is really powerful. And to see how economic impact was deeply impacted just because of this riot. And so again, you want to see what others can. I think a lot of people may look at ESRI and say, oh, there's kind of a one-segmented approach to what we're trying to do, and that is not the case. We believe that a lot of what we're doing in terms of our data is able to paint a picture of what you can do to really solve issues, but then also being real about what was happening during that time. So this is just one example. And again, you can find this on U Chicago's website, and again, it focuses on the 1919 riots. So this is another example. So by training, I'm an urban planner, but I also had the chance to work in economic development. I used to work for an economic development firm that focused on business attraction, retention, and expansion. So if you know anything about Chicago, we're kind of blowing up in terms of our headquarter relocations. We have a number of different headquarters that are here in Chicago. Our tech industry is booming. If you are familiar with 1871, which is an incubator here in Chicago, we have a lot of them, but 1871 is kind of one of our bigger incubators that was voted one of the strongest incubators in the world, which is really powerful. I say that because we have a lot of advantages here in the city of Chicago in terms of headquarter relocations, in terms of our transportation system. Our transportation system is very phenomenal if you think about not only O'Hare and Midway, but just being able to go from one place to another with our Metro line, with CTA, with PACE. And coming from California where I drove all the time, it's a very easy city to navigate. So we have so many things that we can talk about. A diversified economy. We're not just known for one segment. We're not known just for tech. We're not known just for manufacturing. We're kind of doing well in a lot of different industries, and that's a great advantage. But let's be real. Let's talk about that. How are we looking at it from a locational perspective? Is that actually balanced when we look at areas on the south side, on the west side, on the north side, in the central business district? Are we marketing particular areas of the city for businesses to come to in areas that need it most? I would argue that's not the case. And so when I was working at this organization, one of the things I wanted to do was make those linkages happen. How can we talk about the great things that are going on, but talk about workforce and making sure that people who need those jobs get access to that? So a lot of that was really important for me to talk about, which deals with Chicago's wealth divide. So Cranes, if you're not familiar, Chicago business, they actually created what is called a story map. So ESRI has a ton of different products. I can go through all of them, but I want to focus on one because I'm a storyteller, and I think it's really important that you all know that ESRI really believes in the power of storytelling and visualization. So StoryMap is one of our many applications that allows the user to be able to create the story from a spatial perspective. In fact, you don't even have to focus on just a map. You can use this for anything in terms of storytelling. And what Cranes did is they partnered with ESRI to talk about the wealth divide here in Chicago. So as you can see, what they were trying to do is talk about the issue of wealth and where it's actually located. So Naperville, how many of you are familiar with Naperville? So Naperville was actually highlighted in this article to be one of the wealthiest suburbs. Again, this is focusing on Chicagoland area. And so what they wanted to do is concentrate on where the wealth is actually taking place. And as we scroll down, and again, this is what's so powerful about this tool. You can see that these dots represent the issue of income inequality. We're up there. As you can see, we're up there with Los Angeles, with San Francisco, with New York, with a lot of different cities that are dealing with this issue of income inequality. And the middle class is shrinking significantly in a lot of these different cities. And so what this map does, I'm just scrolling down. Again, this product is called StoryMap. I think it's just a powerful tool because it allows a user to be able to tell their own story. And it allows you to be able to use data that we have that is open to be able to really have these conversations about what's going on, to really address how there can be deeper conversations and how you can actually make an impact. So I think, Tanika talked about this a lot. There is a reality of perception, right? We talk about the north side and what that means. We talk about the west side and what that means, the south side, and then coming to Chicago. One thing that I truly hate is how we actually use photos to describe Chicago. All I see is the bean. All I see is that beautiful sign of the Chicago Theater. All I see are bridges. I don't get to see people a lot of times. I don't get to see culture that's actually diversified. I don't get to see children. I don't get to see parks sometimes, or maybe certain kind of parks. And shout out to Humboldt Park because a couple of years ago they were rated the top park in Chicago. Where is that narrative? And so I think it's really important to show all of Chicago. The Bean is great. The Chicago Theater is great. But how can we talk about Pilsen and the vibrancy of what's going on in Pilsen? How can we talk about South Shore and just the artifacts and things that are going on? We have to give a balanced perspective. And I say that because I think pictures, again, tell a story. When we scroll down, I'm just trying to, there we go. Ooh. Okay. So again, this is just another visualization. As you can tell, the red signifies disparities in terms of median household. As we can even just zoom deeper, I don't know if it's working. It may not be, but that's okay. This is actually good. So again, just to paint the picture again, this is the narrative. And we have to talk about this because I think what Tanika mentioned in terms of the value of home ownership, that's a real conversation we need to have. When you see people who are trying to be intentional to invest in their communities and buy in their local communities and what's happening because of real estate values, because of gentrification, and because of a number of different issues. And so I think this map is really important because it paints a picture of even household values. So when you're actually marketing, for example, if you're thinking about a business that wants to come into a particular area, they're not just looking at the issue of jobs and people. They're looking at vitality and quality of life. Where am I going to live? How can I work in an area where I can thrive and be successful, but my housing values can be impactful? So these are a lot of different pictures that we have to paint and be honest about the conversation. And I think the other honest conversation we need to have is these historical, racialized kind of plagues that have haunted us. So we think about blockbusting, restrictive covenant zones. We think about redlining. How that all paints a picture into what's been going on here. We have to be honest about how it's impacted a lot of communities. And so, again, what ESRI is trying to do is say that we want to be able to have these conversations, not only map them, but tell the story and be honest about the story and use data as a way of influencing that story so we can actually make real impact. I'm sorry, I'm calling you out, Tanika, again, because I just think a lot of what she shared is so important. And so she talked a lot about the perception of don't go to the South Side. And I want to give two very interesting stories of a positive that happened. How many of you are familiar with Lollapalooza? Who's been to Lollapalooza? Yes, so if you're not familiar, so Lollapalooza, I can't even say it. Lollapalooza is a cultural phenomenon event where you have, I think it's 4 days of concerts, and it's at Grant Park. And it's very college student oriented, but a lot of people come from across the country, and I would even argue across the world, to engage in this celebration, and all these different artists who come together. So one interesting fact that I thought was powerful was the narrative of students coming to Chicago and finding a place to stay. So I remember vividly, because I worked at an organization that supported the Lollapalooza. There was a chat that was going on with college students saying, ooh, this is where you go and don't go. And we had to nip that in the bud and say, don't do that. But the positive thing about that was there were actually a lot of students, and there's a really powerful article about it, and we need to map this because it was really powerful. A lot of students ended up staying on the South Side. Why? Because it was affordable. So what were they using? Airbnb. So they were trying to find cheap places to stay, because when you're a student, you're broke. You don't have time to be going to places and spending $200 a night to stay at a hotel when you spent how much money on a ticket. Doesn't make sense. So what was really powerful is that a lot of students ended up staying in Bronzeville, in Woodlawn, in South Shore, and guess what? They had a great time because it was affordable. They could take the train. They can do all of that. That's an advantage. We need to talk about that. Again, that's a different narrative and a success to say, maybe the narrative of how we talk about the area is very problematic, and we need to share the successes and how people actually experience the South Side. We need to talk about that. They were able to go to Peaches. They were able to go to Chicken and Waffles. They were able to do a lot of different things. Thank you. We can just start talking about the advantages, right? We can talk about the bean, but we can talk about beautiful things happening in other areas across the city. That is what we are trying to do at ESRI to really actually dispel the narrative. I'm going to do another call out. So are you familiar with Choose Chicago? So Choose Chicago is our tourist organization that really promotes tourism in Chicago. They talk about all the events going on. Again, seeing what others can't. One concern that I have is if you do go to the website, how many neighborhoods do they actually showcase? I'll tell you who they don't showcase. Austin. I don't think Inglewood's on there. I don't think Woodlawn's on there. But guess what's on there? Edgewater. Go ahead. Wicker Park. Which Wicker Park wasn't always historically a neighborhood, right? But they're on there. Keep it going. Who else is on there? Lincoln Park, or I should say Lincoln Square. We have to dispel the narrative. And so I think what's important is that we want to see what others can't. And ESRI is trying to be very intentional to say, we need to fix this. This is a problem. We do. There's a lot that's happening in Woodlawn. There's a lot that's happening in Pullman. Pullman, they had Method. Method, it was a huge opportunity to bring jobs into the area, to bring workforce, and to actually ensure that when you have more companies coming into this area, it promotes other companies to come. We have to talk about that. One last story, and I promise I'm done. So the opioid crisis. This was something that was really deep for a lot of people at ESRI. In fact, one of my colleagues had a cousin who passed away from overdosing. So again, because of something personal that happened to him, he decided he wanted to really investigate what was happening in the Chicago area. So what he ended up doing was creating a map and looking at some of the areas where there's a high usage of opioids and then the number of deaths, unfortunately. But then he, again, remember, ESRI, we want to see what others can't. There is a perception about what the opioid crisis is and where it's located and the type of demographic, and we have to dispel that too. The perception was that it was happening in certain suburbs, in certain maybe wealthier areas. He found out some very interesting evidence about maybe 5 years ago. That was the narrative when he looked at it from a map in terms of what he was showing. But then guess what happened to the opioid? It became synthetic. It became synthetic, which meant it became more affordable, which meant that it spread to particular areas where it was affordable for people to use. What did that show? Because again, remember, historically, when he was showing all the different areas where the opioid crisis was very prominent, there were a lot of healthcare organizations to react to that and to provide those services. And guess what? When the opioid crisis happened in areas that, the opioid was synthetic, you did not see one single health center. So what he said was, look, we need to have a real conversation because it's happening in areas, and this is the power of a map, on the south and west sides. It's increased after that opioid became synthetic. We're trying to see what other people can. We could make these assumptions about the fact it's happening to these specific people, but when it's happening from a larger scale, are we ignoring the issue because of this? Are we ignoring the issue because of class? We have to talk about that. And so his map literally changed the way in which Cook County can be responsive to ensuring that we can have conversations about healthcare organizations coming to those areas. I'm done. Last thing I want to say, I know I'm here for questions. I'll have to leave after, but I'm going to leave my cards outside. Please bug me. I am downtown on LaSalle and Lake. I'm more than happy to have a conversation. Just to shout out, I don't know if I can even do this, but ESRI is also hiring too. We are trying to have people who can think outside the box. And again, seeing what others can't. So we have some really great educational opportunities if you are looking for work. I was told by my HR manager that I need to promote that. So we are looking for people who have ways of thinking about this work differently and being more intentionally. So thank you so much.
Thank you.